Welcome back to Climbing Psychology. Recently, I saw in Adam's videos this book recommendation.
Should I bring this along? There's a chapter on fear of failure, just in case you get scared. If you're going to try a little problem, it's pretty hard.
And also, you have a book as well.
I'd read various books on sports psychology and read different articles, and I thought, would it be amazing if I could get all the best climbers of our time and ask them, like Adam, I asked him some specific questions. What do you think about? And I know this would have helped me massively.
And I really needed to make a review of it. Let's get started. Jerry Moffatt is one of the most brilliant personalities in rock climbing histories. He was widely considered as the best rock climber in the world during the 80s, and he has a lot of experience with virtually every discipline in climbing, from trad climbing, obviously, to bouldering, lead climbing, red pointing with the bolt, free soloing as well, and competition climbing, of course. Let's start with the things I like the most. The whole book has an incredible amount of amazing stories coming from the most important climbers in history. So you have Patata. Alex Megos, Adam Ondra, but also Ben Moon, Margot Hayes, and Pete Whitaker, and also a lot of experts in other disciplines outside climbing. And it's simply amazing to see so many different perspectives and also in different disciplines. We have both cats today. Okay. Another thing I really liked is that at the end of every chapter or of every section, what you find is some pages in which you are able to write down your reflections about what you just read. Sometimes you will have to pinpoint your goals, sometimes you will have to prepare your strategies for the different goals, so like your sub goals and your process goals, or reflections on different aspects that you'll be reading. I don't want to spoil the book too much. But unfortunately, the things I enjoyed the most, or particularly from this book, ends here. So this book, psychologically speaking, is talking about most of the most important theories in sports psychology, but it does in a very superficial way. It's mainly a book that is aimed at psyching you up. And of course, giving a bit of psychoeducation, but mostly what Jerry will do is he give you his own interpretation to the things that you'll be reading about. And this would be absolutely fine, at least in my opinion, if this were an autobiography. But this is mostly a book on mental training for climbing. I mean, this is what is stated on the cover of the book. And this is linked to another point, that is that it refers to a lot of scientific research, which is great, but there is not even one reference in the whole book, which is, scientifically speaking, very bad. And I have the knowledge to recover some of the links that he's been trying to refer to. So some of them I know where they come from, but some others I simply don't. And it's impossible to find out who said or what are the researchers and the studies that are trying to sustain those kind of claims. And in my opinion, this is pretty problematic because Jerry makes some very strong claims that sometimes don't really agree with what the scientists might want to convey in their research. For example, Jerry is talking about punishment sensitivity. And there are some studies that show that punishment sensitivity might be a good skill or like not so bad because it allows the person to detect threats before other people and be able to manage them better because of that, because there is an early processing of them. But I've been looking through it a bit, and the thing is that there is some evidence about this, and mostly comes from super athletes. And here is where we fall into the survival bias. So this specific ability It's something that might work with super athletes, and not even all of them, of course. It's statistics, you know. And they might be able to sustain it because they have the resources, the coping strategies to keep up with it, like with perfectionism, right? And in fact, if you look into the research about punishment sensitivity, you see that there are some very, very severe backsides. So punishment sensitivity has been shown through meta-analysis that is linked and predictive of eating disorders, but also depression and anxiety. And I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. Of course, it's important to talk about it and to say, if you have this kind of sensitivity, it's not the end of the world. You can learn to cope with it, but it's not the narrative that Jerry is actually portraying. And sometimes the knowledge that he's describing is so superficial that it gets over being misleading. It just becomes wrong. So for example, we have this big claim on the chapter on conscious thought. That is, there is very good evidence from scientific research that's shown that most people can focus on 7 things plus or minus 2. So somewhere between 5 and 9. And this is wrong. So the science shows that we are able to focus at most 2 things at the same time. And when we do it, then the quality of the process and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve dramatically decrease. So what does this come from? So as I said, this is one of the references that I know where they come from, because this is a super famous and important study. And it's a study I come from Miller and in the early ages of psychology. And what Miller did was to ask to university students to remember the digits that he was telling. So he would say a number of digits like 5, 7, 9, 4, and the student would have repeated 5, 7, 9, 4. And when he did this kind of experiment, the average number of digits remembered were 7 in a row. That was the chunk. And there was some variance that was plus or minus 2. So between 5 and 9. This was one of the pillar studies in working memory. So what he's actually describing is a study on working memory. And even though he is referring working memory afterwards, it's just very confusing. There are many different types of attention focus, because when we're talking about focus, we're talking about attention. And attention is not a single concept. There is spatial attention, there's sustained attention. There are many types. And this is not even a kind of attention, this is working memory. And when we're talking about multitasking, because this is what we're talking about, right? When you're climbing, you have to think about many different things at the same time. Well, multitasking is not dependent on working memory alone, and it would be very problematic if it is relying on other systems as well. For example, procedural memory is the kind of memory that you have when you're learning to ride the bike, and you don't have to think about it anymore. You can do other things at the same time. Same goes for climbing. There are some things that you don't have to think about, and then you can focus on something else. So multitasking is very complex, and this is not the research that we should be pinpointing or describing it. Not to mention that the study 7 plus or minus 2 was replicated and showed that there was a sample bias, so the average is not even 7, it's more close to 5, because the students have higher cognitive capacities compared to the average population, and we know already. Sometimes some psychological concepts are either not well defined or given an interpretation that comes from him and has no contact with the scientific literature at all. So, for example, when he's talking about motivation, he's talking about, that kind of feeling when you can say, yeah, I feel very motivated and this is how I stay motivated, and has no reference to any motivational theory at all. There are many, many different models that you can rely on, but there's not even one single. Well, but okay. But sometimes it can be really misleading. So, for example, when he's talking about confidence and the importance of positive thoughts, You don't necessarily have to use positive words in a rah-rah corny way. For example, when out bouldering, you might know how to do a move, but just can't do it. Perhaps you're starting to get frustrated. You might give your chalk bag a kick. Then you say to yourself, stop being a complete idiot and do it. For some people, that could actually be quite positive. You're actually saying to yourself, you can do better than this, and you can do it. Come on, do it. No, this is not a positive thought. This is not a positive self-talk. What Jerry is confusing here is the concept of positive with functional, which in my opinion is kind of problematic on a self-help book on psychology. Then another thing that I didn't super enjoy about this book is that it's incredibly performance-oriented. And of course, performance is an important part of mental training for climbing, but there is simply so much more. Like, for example, it's very important that you're able to enjoy the thing you're doing. For example, the most problematic aspect I usually find in the normal population is fear of falling, which is never addressed in the whole book. And that usually impairs people's ability to enjoy the climbing, to enjoy being with people, to enjoy giving support to their friends because they're afraid of making mistakes or belaying. And there's nothing about this. There's nothing about community or like very simple little concept that is not considered as an important part of mental training. The connection with yourself, with your peers, with nature. And it's much more about success rather than achievement, which I don't personally like. This is, of course, my opinion. And what I mean is not that the problem is that Jerry is not a psychologist. There are other books on sports psychology that are written not by psychologists. For example, Climbing Psychology by Kevin Rowett. Kevin Rowett is not a psychologist, but he wrote a very well-designed, well-written book. And it is also very practical in many sense. Of course, he's bringing his own experience to it, but it's mostly to give examples of the theories he's talking about. And I would say that is much more accurate than this book. Then another aspect that should be pinpointed is that sometimes Jerry, since he's a super high level, super elite athlete, and he's talking about other athletes, he has a tendency to generalize his own processes to other climbers as well. So for example, when he's talking about unconscious thoughts, he says, there has to be a driver for super elite performance, and that driver is almost certainly unconscious, which is okay. The thought process that says, I can't finish without winning, will be common amongst elite sport people. Popular thought is that very high-level performance is driven by positive things. Actually, it's probably not. It's most likely to be something negative hidden in the unconscious that drives the fear of failing. I can't finish not winning. I'm losing and I need to avoid losing. I will conquer this. I will not be beaten. I mean, there is, again, no single reference in this book and not in this paragraph. So I don't know if this is actually his own opinion or it comes from, I don't know. But I mean, we have many other testimonies of super elite climbers that say the exact opposite of this. And it's also shown in the book. Chris Sharma says to be able to let it go of it all is the biggest climbing paradox. Adam as well says that if he falls, he gets frustrated, but at the same time, each failure is an opportunity for him to learn and to improve and come back stronger. And if you were to think that maybe this was referred to competitions only, there's also a testimony from Anna Storr that says that when she climbs during bouldering competitions, where she's trying to focus as much as possible, not the competition itself, but being able to climb the next climb, and mostly trying to enjoy herself as much as possible. Or even Margot Hayes says that when she's climbing her best, she's not able to think about what she's thinking. She feels so much in the moment that she's unable to think about anything of the past or the future. To me, this book doesn't feel like really a mental training book, but mostly like a general book on sports psychology applied to climbing, and that is aimed at psyching you up. And of course, that could be absolutely fine, but if you're trying to look for how to do your first pull-up, of course you don't want to only know the anatomy of the muscles that allow you to do the pull-up. You would want to know the mechanics, or like the different variations for different levels depending on where you are, right? So if you're not able to do a pull-up, you might start with Australian pull-ups. And if you want to reach 20 pull-ups, maybe you would need to start with progressive overload. And when I'm looking for mental training for climbing books, then I like to see this kind of setup, right? Psychoeducation is fundamental, but it's important to have also the very next steps. And also the fact that the whole chapter, fear of falling, is lacking. I think it's very, I wouldn't say very bad, but pretty disappointing. So this book apparently has been written with the help of Leo Hardy, who is a super important, super famous sports psychologist. And I wonder what was his contribution. I mean, of course, some parts of the books, most parts of the books are okay, are fine, but there sometimes, as I said, I showed some examples, but the concept might be misleading for how they're written. I don't know if he has read it. I don't know. Maybe I misinterpret what he was writing. I don't know. But again, I cannot even check if I'm misinterpreting it because there is not even a reference on it. I don't know. This book left me confused and disappointed. But maybe I'm misunderstanding what the aim of this book was. Maybe this was a book that was aiming at showing you his own perspective and psyching you up for competition and being the best one in the world. But this is not what I thought when I bought it, at least. But of course, let me know what you think. I'll be reviewing other books on mental training for climbing, so stay tuned for this series. I'll see you in the next video, and stay psyched.